was 45 minutes from signing the biggest retail partnership my division had ever landed when my boss's nephew walked into my office and told me to pack my desk. Not because the numbers were bad. My numbers were the best in the building. Not because a client had complained. My client retention was sitting at 91% after 11 years of grinding. He did it because his college roommate needed a 6-figure title and a corner office, and mine happened to be available the moment someone decided nepotism was a growth strategy. My name is Owen Slade. I was 52 years old. I had spent 11 years at Hargrove and Lund Merchandising Group, building the Western Regional Accounts Division from 4 clients and a shared assistant into a $34 million annual book of business. I knew every buyer, every procurement manager, every VP of vendor relations at every major account we carried. I knew which ones preferred calls before 9 a.m. and which ones only responded to texts. I knew who liked to close deals over lunch at their favorite steakhouse and who needed 3 rounds of revisions before they'd shake your hand. That Tuesday started the way most good days started. Coffee from the place 2 blocks down, not the lobby cart. Desk by 7:30. Open the Hardcastle Outdoor Partnership file. Review the final terms one more time before the 2 p.m. call. 14 months of negotiations on a $22 million private label agreement that would have been our largest single-brand contract in the company's history. 14 months of my Saturdays, my evenings, my cancelled vacations. 2 days before that, I'd been sitting across from their VP of merchandising at a corner booth at the Capitol Grill downtown. She'd told me over a glass of Cabernet she'd barely touched that I was the only account manager their CEO trusted with the steel, that her team had worked with 3 other merchandising groups over the past decade, and that I was the first person who actually understood their product lifecycle the way their own buyers did. That conversation felt like it happened in another lifetime when I saw the calendar invite appear at 10:47 a.m. from my boss's boss, the regional director, who was 3 time zones away and had never once scheduled a same-day meeting with me in 11 years. His name was Philip Lund, Jr., 29 years old, son of one of founding partners. He'd spent the previous 3 years working at a brand consultancy in Austin that had since quietly closed. The company newsletter had described his appointment as Chief Growth Officer as a strategic elevation reflecting our commitment to next-generation leadership. What it actually reflected was a 68-year-old man who wanted to spend more time at his lake house in Michigan and had no one else to hand the keys to. I'd tried to stay open-minded when Philip came in. His first all-hands meeting wasn't a total disaster. He talked about streamlining the vendor onboarding process, which actually needed attention. But then he started talking about ecosystemic brand synergy and building a dynamic client interface layer, and I realized we were watching someone run on buzzwords and confidence, which is a fine combination until something actually needs to get done. I saved my work, straightened my jacket, and walked across the floor to the conference room where Philip was waiting. He was standing at the head of the table, not sitting. That was intentional. He had a tablet in his hand like a prop. His college roommate, a guy named Scott, was seated at the far end of the table with a legal pad and a pen he never once used. "Owen," Philip said without any preamble, "we've been doing a comprehensive audit of our regional account structures." I told him I hadn't been aware of any audit. He said it was internal. Then he said the word realignment. Then he said the phrase fresh perspective on legacy accounts, and I understood exactly where this was going. I asked him directly, "Are you letting me go?" He looked at his tablet, not at me. "Effective end of business today, yes. We'll be transitioning your accounts to Scott's team." Scott's team. Scott, who had joined the company 6 weeks ago with the title of Director of Strategic Accounts, had no background in retail merchandising. His previous job, which I'd looked up the week he arrived because something felt off, was managing partnerships for a mid-sized sports supplement company in Phoenix. He'd never worked with a single one of our client categories. He didn't know the difference between a planogram and a purchase order. "The Hardcastle deal," I said. It closes in 4 hours. Philip told me Scott had been briefed. I asked him if Scott knew that Hardcastle's VP had a specific clause she'd been negotiating for 6 weeks around minimum order flexibility, whether he knew that she needed a verbal confirmation from me specifically before she'd authorize the final signature internally. Whether he understood that this deal had a relationship component that couldn't be transferred in a briefing document. Philip said these were details that could be managed. Then he slid a folder across the table. Non-disclosure agreement, non-solicitation clause, 8 months of severance if I signed before I left the building. He said it was generous. He said the company appreciated my contributions. He said the word contributions the way you'd describe a potluck dish someone brought that nobody touched. I want to tell you I said something sharp and memorable. I didn't. I sat there for a moment looking at the folder. 11 years, $34 million book, 91% retention. I thought about my mortgage on the house in Glenview. My daughter Nora's junior year at DePaul, $19,400 due in February. My son Eli's orthodontic treatment, another $4,800 still outstanding. The car payment on the Pilot I'd bought 6 months ago, because the old one had 190,000 miles. I thought about all of that, and then I thought about something else. I thought about the fact that I had every client's direct cell number saved in my personal phone, not the company CRM. My phone, because half these people had called me on weekends when something went sideways and they needed a human being, not a ticketing system. I thought about the fact that my 11 years of account frameworks, negotiation templates, and vendor compliance tracking systems lived in a folder on my personal cloud drive, built on my own time, never uploaded to any company server because the company server was a disaster and no one had bothered to fix. I thought about the Midwest Retail Buyers Association quarterly dinner I'd been attending for 9 consecutive years, where I knew 40-some of the most influential purchasing decision-makers in the region by first name. I told Philip I needed some time to review the documents with my attorney before signing anything. He said that was my right. His tone suggested he thought I was stalling. I wasn't stalling, I was calculating. I walked back to my office with the folder under my arm. Through the glass partition, I could see my team pretending not to notice. Jennifer, who'd been my senior account coordinator for 6 years, met my eyes for exactly 1 second and then looked away. She already knew. People always know before you do in offices like this. I had 1 hour, Philip had said. I used 50 minutes of it packing what was mine. My personal laptop, my notebooks. I was a notebook person, always had been. The kind of shorthand client notes that meant nothing to anyone else but were a map of 11 years of institutional knowledge. My reference binder. The framed photo of Nora and Eli from a Cubs game 3 summers ago, back when everything felt stable. I left the folder unsigned on my desk. I drove home in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon in a suit, in traffic, and I sat in my driveway for a while without going inside. The shock was specific. That's the thing no one tells you. It's not a general feeling of devastation. It's the shock of a very specific Tuesday afternoon, dissolving into something unrecognizable. The shock of having your calendar go suddenly, completely empty. By Thursday morning, the shape of things had changed inside me from shock to something cleaner. I opened my laptop at my kitchen table and I started taking stock. The non-solicitation agreement I hadn't signed covered active solicitation of current company clients. I knew Illinois employment law well enough to understand what that meant and what it didn't mean. It didn't mean my clients couldn't call me. It didn't mean I couldn't answer. It didn't mean I was prohibited from existing in the professional universe where we all already moved. I updated my LinkedIn. Independent retail merchandising consultant. No mention of Hargrove and Lund. No details. Just available. Then I waited 30 days. That part mattered. I wasn't going to give anyone a legitimate legal argument. I was going to do this right. During those 30 days, I watched from the outside as things began to fracture. The Hardcastle deal collapsed 3 days after I left. I heard about it from a vendor contact who'd heard it from someone on their procurement team. The call had gone badly. Scott hadn't known about the minimum order flexibility clause. When Hardcastle's VP asked for the verbal confirmation she'd discussed with me personally, she was told that the account had transitioned to new management. She'd pulled out of the call within 20 minutes. The $22 million contract went to a competing firm by the following week. I didn't celebrate that. I want to be honest about that. 14 months of my work evaporating in an afternoon is not something I could feel good about, even aimed at a company that had just discarded me. But I noticed it. Week 2, my phone rang at 7:15 in the morning. It was the director of vendor relations at a regional grocery chain that had been one of my most stable accounts for 7 years. He told me he'd received 3 emails in the past week from someone named Scott, each one addressed to the wrong contact name, referencing a product line they discontinued 8 months ago. He asked me if I was still in the business. I told him I was exploring some independent opportunities. He said he wasn't asking for himself. He said he was asking because the annual vendor review was coming up in 6 weeks, and they'd been planning to expand the relationship significantly, and he needed to know what was actually happening over there. I told him I couldn't speak to what was happening at my former employer, but that I'd be happy to meet for coffee as a professional courtesy after my transition period concluded. He said that worked for him. Over the next 3 weeks, 5 more clients called or emailed my personal address. Same pattern every time. Something had gone wrong. A purchase order had been mismanaged. A compliance document had been submitted late or filed incorrectly, triggering a vendor audit. A product allocation had been botched for a seasonal launch window that couldn't be reset. These weren't small errors. Retail merchandising operates on tight windows and specific relationships. Screw up a seasonal launch and you've cost a client their shelf placement for an entire quarter. The call I'd been dreading came on a Wednesday evening, 5 weeks in. It was from my most significant long-term client, a regional home goods chain that I'd been managing for 9 years, since my 2nd year at the company. Their buyer, a woman I'd known long enough to have attended her father's retirement party, called me from her personal number after business hours. She told me that Scott had shown up to their quarterly review meeting without the compliance variance documentation she'd specifically requested 2 weeks prior, that he'd referred to one of their discontinued private label programs as if it was still active, that when she'd asked him about the territory expansion we'd been planning for their Pacific Northwest stores, he'd told her he'd have to circle back. She said, "I don't want someone circling back. I want someone who already knows." I told her that once my transition period ended at the 30-day mark, I'd be available to discuss any opportunities as an independent consultant. She asked me how long until that happened. 8 days, I said. She said she'd mark her calendar. On day 31, I called a man named Douglas Fenn. He was 60 years old, had 32 years in retail merchandising, and ran a boutique advisory firm called Fenn Partners out of a 2-floor office in the West Loop that looked like someone had converted a library into a workspace. He'd been trying to recruit me for 4 years. I'd always had reasons to say no. Those reasons had recently been eliminated. Douglas picked up on the 2nd ring. "I've been waiting," he said, not in a gloating way. He was never the gloating type. Just a plain fact stated plainly. I told him I was ready to have a real conversation. He said, "Come in Friday, and bring the Hardcastle file if you have any personal notes. I want to understand what happened there." I didn't bring client files. Those belonged to Hargrove and Lund. I brought my notes, which belonged to me, and my frameworks, which I had built on my own time, and the understanding that 11 years of institutional knowledge doesn't disappear just because a 29-year-old has your office key. Walking into Fenn Partners that Friday felt like changing altitude, where Hargrove and Lund had marble floors and corporate art that seemed designed to impress people who'd never worked in retail. Douglas's office had whiteboards and working bookshelves and an actual coffee machine that produced actual good coffee. His conference table had edgeware on it. The room smelled like work that got done. He told me he'd been getting calls. I told him I hadn't solicited anyone. He said he knew that. He said 3 of my former accounts had reached out to him independently, asking if he had someone with my background available for project work. He said he'd told them he was working on it. Over the next 2 hours, he laid out a structure. Senior consultant title which kept me legally clear of any non-solicitation complications. 60-40 fee, split in my favor on any accounts I brought over. Full support from his legal team if Hargrove and Lund decided to get aggressive. He'd dealt with companies like that before and said he wasn't concerned. He said, Philip Lund already called me last week. I asked him what Philip had said. He said Philip had implied that any firm assisting a former employee in undermining their client base would be subject to legal action. Douglas had told Philip that he'd been in this industry since before Philip was born and that the threat was noted. He said the conversation ended shortly after that. That afternoon, I met with 2 of the clients who'd called Douglas separately, not at the Fenn Partners office. At a diner near Union Station where no one photographed conference meetings or worried about who was watching. We drank coffee and talked about what they needed and whether I could provide it as an independent consultant through Fenn Partners, which I could. By the end of that week, I had 3 formal consulting agreements in place, all fully above board, all structured to avoid any legal complication. Philip called me on a Thursday morning 3 weeks later. I was in my home office with actual sunlight coming through a window I hadn't had at Hargrove and Lund, watching Chicago traffic from above rather than inside it. He did not say hello. He said, "You have to stop this." I asked him what I needed to top. He said 14 clients had either terminated or significantly scaled back their engagements with Hargrove and Lund in the past 6 weeks. He said it was coordinated. He said my name was coming up repeatedly. I told him I hadn't solicited a single one of them. He said that wasn't the point. I told him I thought that was exactly the point actually. He paused. Then he shifted register slightly, the way people do when the aggression script isn't working. He said his uncle, the founding partner, wanted to speak with me, that there was a possibility of a reinstated role, possibly with a different structure, that the company was in a difficult position and that it would benefit everyone to find a resolution. I thought about what resolution meant to me. I thought about the Tuesday afternoon in the driveway. I thought about Nora and Eli. I thought about 14 months of Saturdays building a deal that dissolved in 4 hours because someone with a sports supplement background didn't know the name of the right contact. I told Philip to have his uncle call me if he wanted. His uncle never called. The news came on a Monday morning 7 weeks after Philip's call. I was at the Fenn Partners office when Douglas's assistant knocked and told me there was something I should probably see on the business wire. Hargrove and Lund Merchandising Group was announcing a strategic restructuring, effective immediately, resulting in a significant reduction in force and a reorientation of the firm's client focus. The press release used words like repositioning and evolving marketplace demands. What it didn't say, but what became clear within 24 hours from industry contacts, was that they had lost approximately 70% of their major account revenue over the past 2 months. The Hardcastle deal was gone. 4 of their 5 largest retail accounts had terminated. Scott had quietly left the company 3 weeks prior. Philip had been moved into an advisory role with no direct reports, which is corporate language for remove from operational control. A regional retail trade publication ran a piece that week about the firm's decline. It mentioned, in the 6th paragraph, that the departure of a senior account director, unnamed, had preceded the departure of a majority of the firm's Western regional client base. It quoted an anonymous industry source saying the firm had made personnel decisions that prioritized internal relationships over client-facing expertise. I read that paragraph twice. Douglas appeared in my doorway with 2 cups of coffee and the expression of a man who had seen this before and was not surprised by any of it. He said, 17 confirmed, 4 more pending. I asked. 17. What? Former Hargrove and Lund accounts now either fully contracted with Fenn Partners or in active discussions. 4 more who'd reached out in the past week but hadn't signed yet. I sat with that for a moment. 17 clients. A majority of the accounts I'd spent 11 years building, not because I'd taken them, because they'd called Douglas's office asking for me by name, one at a time independently, after finding out what had been happening to their accounts under new management. Nora called that night. She was at her apartment near DePaul, studying for a contracts exam, which I found darkly fitting. "Dad," she said, "Jennifer told me what happened. Are you okay?" Jennifer, my former senior coordinator, had reached out to her separately. I hadn't known that. I told Nora I was more than okay. I told her I was partnered at a better firm, doing the same work for people who actually wanted it done well, and that her February tuition wasn't something she needed to worry about. She was quiet for a second. Then she said, "I kind of figured you'd be fine. You always knew more than that place deserved." I've thought about that sentence a lot since then. A year out, I'm a full partner at Fenn Partners. Douglas moved that faster than I expected after the first quarter numbers came in. My accounts now represent roughly 40% of the firm's total revenue. Jennifer followed me over 6 months in, when Hargrove and Lund's restructuring left her role eliminated anyway. 2 other former colleagues have since joined. I got a text from the Hardcastle VP of merchandising last spring. She'd moved to a new company, a regional outdoor lifestyle brand doing about $180 million annually. She said she was heading up vendor partnerships and wanted to know if Fenn Partners was in a position to discuss a preferred supplier agreement. We were. I run into Philip occasionally. Chicago's retail industry is smaller than it looks from the outside. We don't speak. He's been doing something adjacent to consulting, from what I hear. I don't spend time thinking about it. Here's the thing I keep coming back to when people ask me what I learned from all of this. The most dangerous assumption you can make in business is that client relationships belong to the company. They don't. They belong to the person who builds them, maintains them, and shows up when something breaks. You can put a 29-year-old in a chief growth officer title and give him a standing desk and a company credit card and tell yourself you've upgraded your leadership, but the clients are going to find out what they actually have the first time something goes wrong. The first time is usually faster than anyone expects. I'm 53 now. I work in the same industry I've always worked in. I know more buyers and procurement directors than I did 2 years ago. My client retention at Fenn Partners is 94%. I don't work through holidays anymore. That part I changed on purpose. The one thing Philip was actually right about, though he didn't mean to be, sometimes change does open doors you didn't know were there. The door I walked through on that Tuesday afternoon in a suit, carrying a box of notebooks and a photo from a Cubs game, led somewhere better than where I'd been standing for 11 years. I just needed someone to make the mistake of firing me to find out. I've had a lot of time to think about what actually happened. Not the sequence of it, I know that part by heart, but the underlying logic of why it unfolded the way it did. Philip didn't lose those clients because I did anything to take them. He lost them because he made a decision based on what he wanted rather than what the situation required. That's the whole story, really. Every consequence that followed. The Hardcastle deal collapsing, the compliance errors, the trade publication piece, the 70% revenue loss. Every single one of those things was a direct extension of that one original decision. Not bad luck, not a difficult market, a choice made by someone who confused authority with competence and who never stopped to ask whether he actually understood what he was dismantling. I think about that a lot now, because I've seen it from the other side too. I've made decisions in my career that I dressed up in the language of strategy when the honest truth was that I was taking the easier path. Most people have. The difference between those moments and what Philip did isn't the scale of the mistake. It's whether you've built enough integrity over time that one bad call doesn't bring the whole structure down. 11 years of showing up, doing the work correctly, treating clients like people whose problems actually mattered. That's not a reputation, it's a foundation, and the foundation is the one thing you can carry with you when everything else gets taken away. What I keep coming back to is this. The day I sat in my driveway, still in my suit, still holding the box with Nora and Eli's photo on top, I had a choice too. I could have made it ugly. I had enough frustration built up to justify it, at least to myself. Instead, I waited 30 days. I reviewed the legal language carefully. I answered calls I was legally permitted to answer and declined the ones I wasn't. I let clients make their own decisions with no pressure from me. That restraint wasn't weakness. It was the clearest thinking I'd done in years. Because I understood, even in that driveway, even in the shock of a Tuesday afternoon going completely sideways, that the way you handle a setback becomes the thing people remember about you. Douglas didn't partner with me because I'd been treated unfairly. He partnered with me because 11 years of client retention data told a story about who I actually was under pressure. The clients didn't follow me because they were angry at Philip. They followed me because when something went wrong with their accounts, they knew from experience that I was the person who fixed it. That's what integrity actually is, I think. Not a value you perform when things are going well. It's the decision you make at 7 a.m. on a Tuesday when a client calls with a problem and you could easily defer it to someone else. It's the decision you make 31 times over 11 years until the decision stops feeling like a decision and just becomes the way you operate. Nora told me the night things were coming together at Fen Partners that she'd always figured I'd be fine, that the company had needed me more than I'd needed it. I don't know if that's exactly true, but I know that what survived the whole experience, what Philip couldn't take with the key card and the building access and the unsigned folder on my desk, was the part that had never belonged to the company in the first place. That's the part worth protecting, and it only grows stronger every time someone underestimates it.